Welcome into this circle of community. Welcome into this space made sacred by Auckland Unitarians for 114 years. Be not tentative. Bring your whole self. Bring the joy that makes your heart sing. Bring your kindness and your compassion. But bring also your sorrow, your pain. Bring your brokenness and your disappointments. Spirit of love and mystery, help us to recognize the spark of the divine that resides within each of us. May we know the joy of wholeness. May we know the joy of being together. For my opening words, I offer these observations by Robert Fulsom, a socioeconomic person. America has occasionally seen the rise of a particular kind of politician. This kind of politician denounces the establishment in Washington, D.C. They say they speak for the people. They promise to do to conventional politicians what David did to Goliath. This kind of politician flouts political correctness. They attract coverage by provoking the media, yet they prove largely impervious to the negative coverage that follows. They demean their political enemies, not just other politicians, but anyone who opposes them. And this kind of politician finds a group to make the other. The other may be a different race or an immigrant group or even a different economic class. Regardless, this politician demonizes the other as the enemy who has to be stopped. He polarizes. He appeals to fear and anger to attract some voters, but other voters despise him. This politician confounds the establishment, but develops a fiercely loyal base. This politician often becomes the most polarizing figure of an entire era. For this certain kind of rare politician to succeed, it requires just the right timing. That is, the social mood must be negative. This description brings to mind a certain contender for the 2016 presidential election. The truth is that Donald Trump's persona and the style of campaign he is running is not new. Demagoguery has a rich tradition in American politics. When mood turns negative, from Huey Long and the Great Depression to George Wallace in 1968 and 1972. Do New Zealanders know who Huey Long was? No. Some do. Okay. Huey Long was a vile politician from Louisiana during the Depression, but became quite popular. And George Wallace? Yeah, okay. My words for the chalice lighting are these. Out of the flames of fear, we rise with courage of our deepest convictions to stand for justice, inclusion, and peace. Out of the flames of scrutiny, we rise to proclaim our faith with hope to heal a fractured and hurting world. Out of the flames of doubt, we rise to embrace the mystery, wonder, and awe of all there is and all that is yet to be. Out of the flames of hate, we rise with the force of love, love that celebrates our shared humanity. UK Prime Minister Harold Wilson famously said, "A week is a long time in politics." Well, it has been 2 weeks since I expressed my concern that Donald Trump wasn't being taken seriously enough, and that if he got the nomination, his particular set of gifts and the current mood of the electorate could possibly end with him winning in a landslide against Hillary Clinton. One news site that sends me a daily email has been measuring the likelihood of Trump becoming president in terms of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. 2 weeks ago, they were giving it 1.5 horsemen. Today, they're giving it only 1. What has changed? In that time, the Republican establishment has been airing attack ads on their potential nominee, unheard of in my lifetime. Money is flooding to Ted Cruz from billionaires. The Republican National Committee has been looking at how they can modify the rules of their convention to deprive him of the necessary votes. They have been trying to entice a white knight, Paul Ryan, to be available as an alternative candidate in a brokered convention. And Trump himself has made statements about women and abortion that have hurt his numbers, certainly amongst women. So the likelihood of his gaining the nomination, while still high, has decreased. What hasn't changed is the mood of the electorate that has so surprised the establishment of both parties. They never saw Trump or Sanders having even a chance of being nominated. The Democrats have rules in place that give the party elite, senators, congressmen, governors, and party activists, a significant voice to decide the nominee, which does not bode well for Sanders. But if they do not pay attention to the current climate, they may regret playing it safe with the establishment's candidate come the election. A lot has been written trying to explain this mood. Socioeconomist Robert Folsom argues that the mood follows the Dow Jones Industrial Average. In boom years, society becomes collectively more politically correct. He defines that as a tendency towards inclusion, pluralism, contrition, and tolerant speech. This positive mood expression was exhibited from the early 1980s until 2000. It was reflected in laws against sexual harassment and hate crimes and valuing diversity in hiring. It was a time of coming together. Then the mood began to shift in a negative direction, becoming more pronounced in 2008 during the global financial crisis. This was exhibited in challenging the notion of political correctness, replacing its tendency to be inclusive with a new norm of being exclusive, and the acceptance of polarizing, unapologetic, and unrestrained speech. This would explain why Trump's political incorrectness has not harmed him. Quite the contrary, it is at the heart of his appeal, according to his supporters. Many in and outside the Republican Party believe the Republicans themselves are the Frankenstein that created the monster in their midst. Pulitzer Prize-winning political reporter for the New York Times, Nicholas Confessor, has written that the Republican elite has abandoned its most faithful voters, blue-collar white Americans, who faced economic pain and uncertainty over the past decade as the party's donors, lawmakers, and lobbyists prospered. From mobile home parks in Florida and factory towns in Michigan to Virginia's coal mine country, disenchanted Republican voters lost faith in the agenda of their party's leaders. He tells the story of manufacturing executives who had gathered in an Atlanta conference room last year to honor their senior United States Senator, Johnny Isakson, for his tireless efforts on their behalf in Washington. But as the luncheon wound down, Mr. Isakson found himself facing a man from a rural county in Georgia. The man, Burl Finkelstein, told him Trade policies with Mexico and China were strangling the family-owned kitchen parts company he helped manage and imperiling the jobs it provided. Mr. Isaacson politely brushed him off, Mr. Finkelstein recalled, as he had many times before. So when the Georgia primary rolled around, Mr. Finkelstein, along with many others in his town, pulled the lever for Donald J. Trump, who made him feel that someone had finally started listening. He gets it, Mr. Finkelstein said in a recent interview. Some believe political theories have done a poor job accounting for the rise of Trump, leaving befuddled observers to turn to psychology in search of answers. Recently, that field provided the best explanation yet for his appeal among a sizable segment of the electorate. The boorish billionaire's appeal isn't due to his inconsistent conservatism or his newfound religiosity. Rather, it is grounded in authoritarianism, an impulse that underlies both ideology and faith. Political scientist Matthew McWilliams wrote, "Trump's electoral strength and his staying power have been buoyed above all by Americans with authoritarian inclinations." In an online poll of 1,800 Americans conducted late December, he found an authoritarian mindset that is, belief in absolute obedience to authority, was the sole statistically significant variable that predicted support for Trump. Sociologist Theodore Adorno first described the authoritarian personality in 1950, linking the mindset to simplistic thinking, intolerance of ambiguity, and racial prejudice. In their 2009 book, Mark Hetherington and Jonathan Weiler described authoritarianism's impact on politics, noting that authoritarianism is really about order, achieving it, maintaining it, and affirming it. This has obvious appeal in a changing, often frightening world. Indeed, research shows there are emotional benefits to holding such beliefs. A 2013 Canadian study found a link between authoritarian values and a subjective sense of well-being. Sounds odd, doesn't it? Much previous research has tied conservatism to higher levels of perceived threat. It's hard to reconcile how people can feel threatened and have a strong sense of well-being. On the other hand, a strong sense of social hierarchy, the notion that everyone has their place, can arguably provide a coherent structure that makes the world seem less chaotic and theoretically more controllable. That could, in turn, promote a sense of well-being. And of course, religious belief plays a role in authoritarian thinking, as one might expect. In a new study, psychologist Catherine Johnson noted that taking the Bible literally was linked to prioritizing authority-related concepts as obedience, respect for tradition, and a desire for the social order. McWilliams expressed concern that continuing incidents of terrorism may bring out the authoritarian impulses of otherwise reasonable people, perhaps adding to Trump's support. He cited a 2011 study that found many average Americans become susceptible to authoritarian thinking when they perceive a grave threat to safety. But other research throws doubt on that claim. A 2015 study looked at public attitudes in the UK following the July 7, 2005 terrorist attacks on the London Underground. It found opinions did temporarily shift rightward, with a short-lived increase in anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiments, and a lessening of support for the concept of fairness for all. Importantly, however, the researchers found the participants' views about obeying authority did not significantly change in the wake of the tragedy. This defied their prediction and suggests attitudes towards authority figures are held deeply and not significantly swayed by day-to-day events. That may signal a ceiling to Trump's support. Fear does activate our instinct to protect our own, but it doesn't necessarily make us want to submit to the whims of a strongman. A friend of mine, Wayne Brittenden, a New Zealander who has worked for the BBC as a political journalist and produced many independent documentaries, and most recently did a segment on national radio called Counterpoint for a number of years on Sunday mornings, argued, when I told him about the topic of this sermon, that I need to look further back in history for an explanation of the Trump phenomenon. He is about to publish a paper on how the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 created the slippery slope that brought us to that point. I'll explain the Taft-Hartley Act in a moment. Robert Taft, a conservative Republican senator from Ohio, was the son of President William Howard Taft. Fred Hartley was a conservative Republican congressman from New Jersey. Their act was a frontal assault on the union movement. After World War II, 25% of the workforce was unionized. And with the war now over, their promise not to strike so as not to impede the war effort had expired. As a response to the rising union movement and Cold War hostilities, the bill was a response by business to the post-war labor upsurge of 1946. During the year after VJ Day, more than 5 million American workers were involved in strikes, which lasted on average 4 times longer than those during the war. The Taft-Hartley Act was seen as a means of demobilizing the labor movement by imposing limits on labor's ability to strike and by prohibiting far-left radicals from union leadership. Large business lobbies, including the National Association of Manufacturers, promoted the law. The Taft-Hartley Act prohibited a wide variety of strikes, boycotts, picketing, closed shops requiring union membership, and monetary donations by unions to federal political campaigns. It also required union officers to sign affidavits with the government declaring they were not members of the Communist Party. States were allowed to pass right-to-work laws that outlawed closed union shops. Furthermore, the executive branch of the federal government could obtain legal strike-breaking injunctions if they deemed that an impending or current strike imperiled national health or safety. That such a bill came from Republicans who represented business interests was not surprising. What was surprising is that a majority of Democratic representatives of the House and 21 of 42 senators supported the bill. This was a major repudiation of their traditional role as supporters of working men and women. President Truman, who had remained silent about his position prior to the vote, did veto it. His veto was overridden with considerable Democratic support. 106 of 177 Democratic representatives and 20 out of 42 senators voted to override the veto, making it law. While having vetoed it, Truman would use the act 12 times to break strikes. While I don't know yet what Wayne's paper will argue are the implications of the Taft-Hartley Act, he wouldn't tell me, I see 2 in particular. It laid the groundwork for implementing neoliberal economic theories, which required making labor a commodity by breaking labor's capacity to act collectively for their own interests. Neoliberalism touts individualism because individuals feel and are often, in fact, powerless against organized corporate interests. The Taft-Hartley Act has resulted in the undermining of the working class. Economist Robert Reich, in his book Saving Capitalism, explains how. In the 1950s, a school teacher, baker, or mechanic could earn enough to buy a house, purchase 2 cars, and raise a family. And this is no longer possible unless they are willing and able to borrow substantial sums of money. And remember, this is a time when mothers stayed at home. So they were living on one income, but it was enough. CEOs of large corporations now earn more than 200 times the average worker's income, compared to with 20 times 50 years ago. The richest 1% of Americans now receive more than 20% of the country's income, compared to 9 to 10% in the 50s and 60s. Politicians pay more attention to the needs of the large corporations compared with individuals because these corporations are successful lobbyists and make huge political donations. He argues that corporate and financial elites have huge political influence and have been able to dictate the way the U.S. economy operates. These elites have actively reorganized the rules of the free market for their own benefit. Free markets in quotes. The second implication is that the act marks the beginning of the working class losing faith in the Democratic Party to represent their needs. This ironically led to blue-collar workers abandoning their party to vote for Reagan. As Reagan was the front man for selling neoliberalism to the American public, it was a devastating decision by the working class. After 30 years of neoliberalism supported by both parties, they now feel abandoned. Politicians who are not part of what to them is a rigged system are going to be appealing. Noam Chomsky, an American linguist, philosopher, social critic, political activist, and author of more than 100 books, recently commented that this reaction is not just an American one, but international. The U.S. is not immune to the general decline, he says, of the mainstream political parties of the West. And the growth of political insurgencies on the right and the left, though the left means moderate social democracy in practice. It is one of the predictable consequences of the neoliberal policies that have undermined democracy and caused substantial harm to most of the population, the less privileged sectors. How all of these factors will play out in the nomination process and the election, I have no way of knowing. But I don't think they're going to go away anytime soon. My concern is that if establishment powers that be are able to quash this rising insurgency this time, even more people will lose faith in democracy. I think about the large numbers of young people who have, for the first time, decided to engage in the electoral process. If they come away from the experience feeling that they have been cheated, they will find other ways to express their frustration. We may face very turbulent times ahead. I'm also concerned that we may be too complacent about these forces here. We are no more immune to them than the U.S. When democracy becomes something to be manipulated in a cynical manner, undermining our trust, civil society is in peril. Our two major parties are both beholden to neoliberalism. Our labor laws are just as draconian as the Taft-Hartley Act. Our politicians divert us from real issues regarding the common good with flag referendums, while they enact policies the majority oppose. Our government has promoted our country becoming a tax haven for the very rich without blushing. This should not be a concern just for us as Unitarians, with our strong belief in democracy and our passion for social justice. It should be a concern for all New Zealanders. The conditions are ripe for a Trump being in our future. From your vantage point, how many horsemen are on our horizon? I see 2.5. For my closing words, there is too much hardship in this world to not find joy every day. There is too much injustice in this world to not right the balance every day. There is too much pain in this world to not heal every day. Each of us ministers to a weary world. Let us go forth now and do that which calls us to make this world more loving, more compassionate, and more filled with the grace of divine presence every day.